Welcome to Asian American Parenting, a podcast from Rooted Ministry and the Sola Network, where the gospel meets Asian American faith, culture, and parenting. Each episode, we explore how to raise the next generation with a strong gospel foundation in Christ while navigating the unique challenges of our cultural identity. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in. Welcome. I'm Danny Kwan, a co-host. I'm Rooted's Senior Director of Youth Ministry Content and Cross-Cultural Initiatives. And before joining Rooted, I was a youth pastor for 29 years at one Asian American church. And this is my co-host Monica Kim, my wife, who's also a biblical counselor and psychologist, whose PhD work specialized in parenting and attachment theory. Say hello, Monica.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah. And Monica, I know you were a great co-servant with me in our church ministry, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And today in our second episode, we're going to continue kind of our introduction in this idea of what is gospel-centered parenting and Asian American parenting. I mean, eventually we are going to get into some specific topics like academics and Asian Americanness in the gospel, Asian Americanness and future jobs for our children, and how we think about that in our culture and faith, Asian Americanness and how we nurture our children's talents versus how we nurture them in their faith in the Lord, parenting anxieties versus the gospel, and how our Asian American faith has an impact on that, being raised in the first and second generation churches and how that impacts our gospel-centered parenting, and a slew of other issues. But today we wanted to continue again in a little bit of our introduction to this topic of what is gospel-centered parenting in the Asian American church. We talked about the intersection of faith, culture, and parenting. And for me, I often think about Judges 2:10, where it says, "And all the generation were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or work that he had done for Israel." So me and you, Monica, we go to church. We were raised in faith by our first generation parents who did not speak English, went to a church that was not English speaking. They were immigrants, but we went to church, were raised up in our faith. And, you know, when I think about our kids and I think about the third generation, and this verse from Judges 2:10, "And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord," you know, and from Joshua's generation to what happened in Judges 2:10, it's always kind of a sobering reminder of Asian American parents, of maybe some of our Asian American influences of culture, of parenting that might influence our faith and our view of the gospel and how we raise our kids. You know, I know for first generation parents, because they didn't speak the American English language, they gathered at church, and faith was kind of a social center of their lives, but was also a faith center of their lives. But for second generation parents like us, we're in ministry, so, we go to church, but sometimes, the influences of culture have lessened the impact of faith. Any thoughts on that?
hmm yeah, the influence of culture, but also the influence of maybe even our first generation church culture.
Yeah.
Maybe all of those may have impacted uh, how we might prioritize um, the emphasis on serving the Lord and passing that down to our generations after that. Yeah. Uh, I also think about, I think, um, just when you were talking about Judges, the passage in Judges, and I think sometimes what we also lose is the priority of the gospel in our lives. And I'm not using this passage to like, we don't want to, it's not about fearing people to believe, right? But the priority of the gospel, um, above and beyond anybody's culture, even as it intersects it, right? Because the gospel did come into, the Bible often is about speaking into culture,
Mhm.
in every culture from the Old Testament, kind of, and reshaping it and reorienting uh, uh, the particular cultural context in which the scripture is spoken into, God's word is spoken into. But what for me comes to mind is the challenge of the passage, even in Mark chapter 8, for thinking about our parenting and how we ought to, think about our children when it says in verse 36, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul?
Hmm.
It's a sobering, I think, um, you know, word of, Jesus as he was speaking to, the crowd and his disciples, that about following after Jesus and being a disciple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's two things on that. Like, as a youth and family pastor for 29 years, and seeing parents like us, second gen parents, sometimes, unfortunately, we've maybe lost the biblical calling, Deuteronomy 6, Proverbs 22, Ephesians 6, of discipling our kids.
hmm
That's for all cultures,
Yeah.
not just Asian culture, but
hmm
you know, because we're um, in some ways children of immigrants, and our parents lived, in poverty, and they had to work
Some of
16-hour days,
yeah.
and so we, you know, and we had to go to college in America, and had to you know, you know, succeed in some way. We want that for our own kids. As Asian Americans, we want our kids to, you read Mark 8, what good it is for to inherit the whole world but forfeit his soul. But sometimes that's what we kind of
Yeah.
unintentionally or live out to our kids as Asian American parents.
hmm
Yeah,
Yeah. 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 And again, just emphasizing what you said, it's, in all different cultures where that's happening.
yeah,
The gospel priority gets lost by the social, cultural, historical kind of mandates or the pressures around us. And there are particular ways in which the Asian American context or community might grapple with that. that's a little different from, let's say, mainstream culture too, in the sense that, as you already mentioned, prioritizing the gospel in the midst of um, historical, generational, country origin of country trauma, along with immigration, along with acculturation, challenges to orient oneself to such a different culture and parent the children. Then there's also, for, let's say, second or even third generational Asian Americans, the social, particular kind of cultural milieu might involve trying to make sense of, the disconnect with our parents, and then feeling much more of the pressures, and not understanding, and not being really so disconnected that you have such a hard time understanding, and you feel like you're without your parents' support to navigate so many adjustments that you have to make as immigrant children, and et cetera, et cetera. So many kind of social, cultural, historical kind of contexts to navigate that will often take us away from this gospel hope and orientation to be able to grasp onto. And yeah, that's what we're trying to get to. How do parents, in the midst of all those layers as Asian Americans, where we have had so many kind of barriers or even challenges or hardship that are unique to us, that make the gospel call for discipling our children and prioritizing faith on this side of heaven come to bear? What would that look like?
So as a psychologist, your PhDs in parenting and attachment, and also as a biblical counselor, like, where is the tension and balance of, you know what good is it to inherit the whole world and forfeit his soul, that we're not living out the biblical calling to raise our kids in faith, and we're more stressing their success and their SAT scores and their grades, and that faith takes a secondary seat to in their lives.
Mm-hmm. And in some cases, maybe faith is the also the driver to succeeding too, using faith to um, drive the success. Sometimes it can almost sometimes feel like that in the Asian American context too. Having said that, uh, in terms of the uh, that tension, I as you I would not want to say it is an either or,
Yeah.
because the gospel comes into our culture and really breaks through and reorients us. So it's not like we become
Mm-hmm.
cultureless people, and somehow we just kind of flattens out and flatten out the gospel is so powerful to speak into, um, help us to reflect and examine from where we've come, and how we can dig deep into finding the comfort and the hope of the gospel that reorients us to, um, really, in the midst of our everyday lived kind of living circumstances, to be able to continue to look to the cross and the resurrection again and again in so many different ways in the various everyday crevices of parenting life with our children,
Hmm.
Asian Americans.
Yeah. So, like, let's just take the topic of academic success.
Mhm.
And, we want our kids to do well academically, but
Mhm.
when does it cross over into sin that we're pushing them so hard, or we're just obsessing over them as parents that, we only seem to care about academic success,
Mhm.
or it becomes the priority. You can miss church on Sunday because you have a business leaders club or sports or band or something.
Yeah, especially since that is also a huge cultural value.
Yeah,
Education, such a huge cultural value that
yeah.
if you don't have education, then then it's hard to do much, right? Um, uh, uh, yeah, in terms of that question of how does it teeter into idolatry and sin, or when is it too much? I don't think it's also like one size fits all,
Yeah.
in the sense that there are so many kind of facets to it or nuances to consider. Uh, I think there is the call for all of us as parents who need to reflect on recognizing that in our culture, education has taken such a priority. Uh, you know, uh, that we do need to reflect on our hearts
Yeah.
before the Lord ourselves and wonder, how have we prioritized that as our saving, in place of the saving grace of God, because
Mhm.
we think of that as a way to save our family, or or survive or succeed, right? From our sense that of a fear of being no more.
Mhm.
So if we think about that being something important to reflect on, that's really important. Another part is just we'll probably go into a little bit more in later episodes also, but as another kind of a thing to think about is sometimes when we education for children, for our kids, it's not a bad thing, right? uh, 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 our culture in our world, in the US today, really every child goes to school, and it is supposed to be a really good thing to have access to education, which is really important. It is a something that God has given to us, so that is a good thing too. um, in the midst of that good, though, sometimes we might also miss out our children and how they have been given specific kind of talents, maybe even areas where they excel, but also areas they may not be as good in. Sometimes we want to fit them into this mold that they have to be excellent at everything.
Yeah.
And and if we start to do that, and we become very anxious if our kids don't excel in one area but they do in another. Some parents might start to become very anxious because we're all also, many, thinking about, well, they have to do well overall in order to get to a certain kind of college where we so value education.
Yeah.
That kind of college they get to is so important to us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are so many facets to reflect on and consider, that are we then trying to mold our children without thinking about how God has created them to be, and getting to know them and
Yeah.
foster,
Yeah.
uh, you know, their talents for the glory of God. How do we love them,
Yeah.
to love the Lord with their talents? We may actually even miss that out sometimes. And those are just two things, that comes to mind when we're when you ask that question about education and specifically where can it, flip, or where can it get challenged, and we don't see the gospel in the midst of it.
So, you might have a family might have a child who's excellent academically, but then might have a child that does not just academically inclined, but has
Yeah.
different gifts and talents in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And to be able to really nurture and recognize that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why in the midst of those differences, um, uh, uh, the hope of the gospel gives us so much more hope for all of these diverse, very different kind of ways of being and living, uh, as opposed to the more restrictive mandate of whether it is our cultural, um, value as Asian Americans, but also the cultural value as it intersects even the challenges of living in a society that we often feel we often feel like we're perpetual foreigners too. And so there are so many aspects that pressure us to be more, but the gospel can free us from that pressure to be more.
Like, how do we know how much we need to help and nurture and even push our kids
Mhm.
academically? I'll just use that example since we're talking about it, versus we're doing too much, we're pushing too much. Maybe they're not academically inclined, or,
Mhm.
we're exasperating them, as Ephesians 6 says, and
Yeah,
we're provoking them to anger,
yeah.
and we're you know, making them hate Jesus, in my youth pastor vernacular.
Hmm.
You know, like
Hmm.
that.
Especially if parents say, do it for the glory of God,
Yeah,
but you pressure them
yeah,
when it's too much, right? Now,
yeah.
how do you know? Going back to that question, uh, I think it's also, you're probably, we'll probably be talking about this over and over again, that it's not like such a simple answer.
Yeah.
Do you actually know, right? But it is about a journey and gaining wisdom on getting to know your children, and their unique, not only talents, but also ability to experience the pressure and then to be able to withstand it too. That is also very different.
Mm-hmm.
At different the teenagers will have such different ability to be able to withstand that too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if I think about my three children, each are so different.
Our three children.
Yeah, our three children,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
when they were teenagers, they responded so differently to the pressure, right? To say, hey, um, and mind you, we were also having to, as parents, reflect on where's our heart in the midst of encouraging or uh, uh, you know um, uh, 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 calling them out to continue to grow, let's say, in their academic abilities. uh, we had to really think about our hearts, but also think about each of the teenagers that we've had and the way in which God gave them various talents, but also various abilities to experience the um, call or the pressure to do things academically, and how to then give them the support, but also how to relent when needed too.
Mm-hmm.
So there are so many kind of facets that I know we'd have to think about as parents, in light of, when is it too much, and when it is it not enough too.
And, for an immediate next episode, I think this idea that you're alluding to is, you say this a lot, and I know you've gotten it from others, connection before correction,
Mm-hmm.
connecting with your child before correcting them,
Or
you know,
challenge them.
or challenging them. But because we've been influenced in Asian American Confucian hierarchy, how does, maybe as a parent, I need to flush that out in my life and recognize where that Confucian ethic is pervasive in me versus the gospel.
Yeah.
And I need to be more connection before
First.
correction.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Just something very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. It's a very interesting topic. Yeah. So before we go, and we think about our next episode, I do want to end with a little bit of a lighter question so the audience can continue to get to know you and I. And last time we talked about our most cherished moment from our teenage years. And so this time, what is the most horrible or terrible memory from your teenage years? And I'll go first this time. For me, I got into 3 solid universities, but I was rejected from 7 others. All the Ivy Leagues I applied to, all the top schools. And so I just remember how terrible of a memory it was. Back then, you were actually mailed your acceptance or rejection letters from college. And I remember 7 days in a row getting letters of rejection from college. And it was really sad. I wrote about this in a book that Rooted wrote, Jesus, I Wish I Knew, for the Asian American teenager, and how I felt so shameful, even though my parents didn't make me feel shameful. And I didn't come home from college for 2 years because I didn't get into an Ivy League school. And so that's kind of one of my most terrible memories from high school. How about you, Monica?
My most difficult memory in high school, or when I was a teenager, was in high school. I was, volleyball player, and at that time, given that I was a setter, and
You were MVP of your team?
yes,
Yeah.
I did get that. And at the same time, in my last year, I started to develop some anxieties. It was pretty intense, and I didn't know how to manage it. I didn't even know that I was suffering from it. But what had happened was I just felt I just couldn't play anymore.
Mm.
And I quit.
Yeah.
It was really, really hard, and
Yeah.
it's a tough memory.
Yeah.
I just look back and think, gosh, if I had a little bit more support in my last year of, I understood a little bit more about how deeply anxious I was,
Yeah.
and to be able to face it with that kind of encouragement and support. Yeah, but I felt really, it was, yeah.
And that'll be a future topic for this Asian American parenting, this podcast, because mental health and Asian American culture and faith, and how even from our parents' generation to our generation, how we view mental health and mental health treatment and things like that. I think that'll be an important episode that we revisit. But until next time, for our listeners, We want to encourage you to subscribe to the podcast, Asian American Parenting, and we look forward to episode 3 next time. And until then, may we embrace the hope and joy of the gospel and believe that it's true, powerful, and transformative for our personal lives and for our lives and our parents and teenagers. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We hope that you have enjoyed this podcast. For more resources, visit the show notes. See you next time.